Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out to celebrate National Minority Health Month and to celebrate the National Public Health Week. This is a very important topic to discuss. Before I came to the Virginia Department of Health, I spent about a little over 20 years at the University of Virginia. And one of the things that always got to me there was walking around grounds and seeing all this history and tradition that people didn't really understand, right? So there was Jordan Hall, Behringer Hall, Alderman Library, all staunch eugenicists who were honored. Only recently was Jordan Hall's name changed to Penn Hall, named after Vivian Penn, second black woman to go to UVA med school, a national leader in science, headed up the Office of Women's Health at NIH for many, many years. So Jordan Hall is no more, it's now Penn Hall. I'm looking forward to the name changes at Behringer and Alderman. We'll see how soon that takes place. We'll have someone from UVA who can speak to that a little more directly. So anyway, this is really important that we get some education about the history of eugenics and the role that public health played in that, since these folks are all leaders in the public health world. And it's important to know that history as we move forward in doing the work that we're doing today to eliminate health inequities, and being able to do that requires our understanding of this history. So welcome, and we'll move on with the panel.
Thank you. I do want to acknowledge Secretary of Health, Secretary Dan Carey. Thank you for being here. Appreciate you for being here. So, thank you. So I'd like to invite our panelists up. Please join us in the front. And while they're joining us, I will introduce them. We are waiting for one additional panelist. As you know, government buildings are so easy to find and easy to get into. And so we are just awaiting one more panelist that will be really excited when he gets here. He will add an additional, very interesting perspective to this discussion. First, Dr. Roscoe Bird, Jr. Dr. Roscoe William Bird, Jr. is a professor emeritus at Virginia State University, where he led the Animal Sciences Department from 1985 to 2002. Prior to joining the faculty at VSU, Dr. Bird had a career in public health with the United States Army. He entered the Army Veterinary Corps in 1964 and retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1985. His career included food inspection and directing a rabies laboratory. In 1973, Dr. Bird received a Master of Science in Infectious Disease from Kansas State University in Manhattan, Kansas, and a Doctor of Veterinary Medicine from the historic Tuskegee Institute in 1964. Tuskegee is also his hometown. He completed the Tuskegee Institute High School in 1956. Dr. Bird's parents are also Tuskegee alumni. His father was an administrator at Tuskegee, and his mom a teacher at the historic Chambliss Children's House School for the children of Tuskegee Institute faculty before becoming principal of the Cerebral Palsy School of Chicago. Please welcome Dr. Roscoe Bird, Jr. Mary Faith Marshall. So Dr. Marshall is the director of the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Humanities and director of the program in Biomedical Ethics at the University of Virginia School of Medicine. With her colleagues Lois Shepard and Julia Taylor, she co-founded its program Studies in Reproductive Ethics and Justice. She is professor of public health sciences in the School of Medicine and professor in the Schools of Nursing Law University faculty. She co-chairs the UVA Health System Ethics Committee, directs its Ethics Consult Service, and her expertise includes reproductive, clinical, and research ethics. She is the past president of the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities and the American Association for Bioethics. She served on the ASBH Healthcare Ethics Certification Task Force from 2016 to 2017 and is a member of the inaugural class of Healthcare Ethics Consultants to be certified by the ASBH. She's an elected fellow of the American College of Critical Care Medicine, where she is vice chair and forthcoming chair of the Ethics Committee. In 2017 and 2019, she received SCCM presidential citations for outstanding contributions to the Society of Critical Care Medicine. Dr. Marshall received the Trailblazer Award from the NAACP Charleston chapter in 1999 for her work in policy approaches to perinatal substance use disorder and has testified on this subject before Congress and in the U.S. District Court. She was a member of the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists Committee on Ethics for 11 years. She is a member of the editorial board of the American Journal of Bioethics. Please welcome Dr. Marshall. Ms. Kimberly Carr is a third-generation descendant of the United States Public Health Services syphilis study at Tuskegee and vice president of Voices for Our Fathers Legacy Foundation. Voices for Our Fathers Legacy Foundation's mission is to preserve the legacies and history of the 623 men victimized in the USPHS syphilis study by fostering social justice, education, and public health research. She is also a PhD candidate in the Integrative Biosciences PhD program at Tuskegee University and received her Master of Public Health degree from Morehouse School of Medicine. Her research interests primarily include assessing the intersectionality between the role of environmental chemicals, food insecurities, and chronic disease risks in vulnerable populations. Kimberly is a scholar in the National Science Foundation Alliances for the Graduate Education and Professoriate, and graduate fellow in the Interinstitutional Network for Food, Agriculture, and Sustainability Graduate Fellows Program at University of California, Davis. And she came all the way from Tuskegee, Alabama. Thank you for being here. Dr. Mignon C. Guy. Dr. Guy's research focuses on social, behavioral, biological, and environmental determinants that contribute to health disparities among racial and ethnic minority and other marginalized populations. Most recently, her research examines biobehavioral and environmental factors associated with tobacco-related disparities among young adults and adult populations. She has a strong interest in the complex interplay between distal structure and proximal factors and how they shape the health behaviors and outcomes in African Americans. She is co-investigator in the Virginia Commonwealth University Center for the Study of Tobacco Products, where she and her colleagues investigate the diversity of use behaviors of emerging tobacco products and how these behaviors are transmitted through social media, as well as the role of flavorants in the initiation and maintenance of using tobacco products. As principal investigator, she recently completed a study funded by the Truth Initiative that examined culturally targeted flavored little cigar and cigarillo smoking prevention media for Latino and African American youth. Please welcome Dr. Guy. And last but not least, I'm getting lots of practice reading here out loud. Commander Anthony Johnson, and Dr. Johnson, is a senior officer with the United States Public Health Service with over 10 years of service. His present operational detail is with the Department of Homeland Security, Immigration Health Service Corps, where he serves as a regional behavioral health consultant, managing staff and behavioral health clinical operations serving over 20,000 persons in the global migrant communities. Prior to his current assignment, he served as a program management officer for the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. His work focused on contract administration, systems development, data collection and analysis, and program evaluation for state jurisdiction and Native American behavioral health programs. In addition, he served as a lead participant protection officer, directing research policy administration, grantee organization infrastructure assessment, and protocol approval for conducting research with human participants. Commander Johnson has over 25 years of experience within healthcare administration, budget and financial management, organizational leadership, and staff development, and in the behavioral health field as a clinician, researcher, community advocate, published author, professor, policy advisor, and program director within various community and federal agencies, including prior service with the Indian Health Service, Bureau of Prisons, and Veterans Health Administration. Please welcome Commander Johnson. So I encourage you all to be active listeners and to really engage in the conversation when the opportunity comes. These panelists have a variety of thoughts and opinions, and I really hope that you enjoy the discussion to come.
So we'll start with some opening comments from our panelists, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience, and I'm sure you will be inspired to ask many. I'd like to start with Dr. Bird, if you could just give us a few opening remarks.
Good morning. My claim to fame, as far as the study was concerned, was that I grew up in Tuskegee, and I knew some of the people. If you read the history of the study, some of the people that lived in Tuskegee that were involved with the study, such as Dr. Dibble, who was head of the University Hospital, and Nurse Rivers, who was responsible for picking up the patients and bringing them to have them examined by the physicians, and another physician from the VA hospital at Tuskegee, and his name was Dr. Peoples. And I was born there in 1938, and the study, of course, started before I was born, back in 1932. But we ran around the university campus. I lived right off the campus, a block from the football stadium, and not very far from the university hospital. So we used to go over to the hospital all the time. And not for the study, but back during that time when I was growing up, had polio. And at the University Hospital, there was a wing for children that had infantile paralysis, polio, and they had the iron lung that you may see on the Easter seal stamps. And we'd go over and was really interested in that at the time. But I went to veterinary school in Tuskegee, but we never discussed the study. We weren't aware of it, actually. And I wasn't aware of it until it was in the newspapers. And, I was quite surprised. Of course, I was surprised for one reason that it went on there. It wasn't in town near the university. It was out in the rural areas. The people that they were examining that had syphilis were farmers in Macon County, which Tuskegee is part of Macon County. And so, as I said, we were quite surprised, like everybody else, to learn about the study. And so that's why I'm here, because I was there growing up while it was going on, but had no knowledge. Thank you.
Next, we'll hear from Dr. Marshall.
I'm old enough to have taken care of a patient in an iron lung. The iron lung is now in the history component, the medical history component of the Health Sciences Library at UVA. But probably not too many people around these days who's taken care of patients in an iron lung. So just a little bit of history. My perhaps introduction to the study was through my mentor at the University of Virginia, John Fletcher. John was the first bioethicist at the NIH and came to the University of Virginia to start the Center for Biomedical Ethics there, and he was a wonderful mentor. He and Vanessa Worthington Gamble, also a bioethicist, early bioethicist in the field, co-chaired the committee that resulted in President Clinton's presidential apology. for the study. One of my treasures, I've got show and tell here, but one of my treasures is an invitation to Tuskegee University for the anniversary weekend of the presidential apology. The theme for the day, or I guess the question that's been posed to all of us is, could it happen again? And I will maybe at some point during the next hour or so say that yes, it can. And talk about a study that some of you may or may not know about that happened at the Medical University of South Carolina in Charleston, South Carolina. I went there from the University of Virginia in 1993. It did happen there. It wasn't funded by the public health unit of the federal government, but it had many of the elements of what happened at the study at Tuskegee, sort of following the course of a natural disease and other things. So maybe I'll hold off on that, and we can talk about it a little later.
Ms. Carr?
Good morning, everyone. It is an honor to be here. Oftentimes when we discuss the USPHS syphilis study at Tuskegee, the descendant family member is hardly ever included. So I'm very honored to be here to share my lived experience and my family's lived experience, and to honor one of the 623 men, my great-great-grandfather, John Good. I have permission from my family as well to discuss this, so that's always great. He was a syphilitic, and my grandmother took care of him. She was the oldest of 10. So as we go along in the program, in the forum, I'll discuss more about that. Also the misconceptions of it, the Miss Evers boys, calling it an experiment when it's actually a public health study. And to imply for it to be an experiment, you have to have some type of written protocol. And as Dr. Marshall has said, yes, it can happen again. Recently, two researchers from the Georgia State Law School have uncovered that the specimens have not been destroyed. So now it is a movement of where are the biospecimens and what are they doing with it. The government has not showed any indication that the records were destroyed. So they're somewhere sitting in a shelf at the CDC somewhere, but those biospecimens from Guatemala and Tuskegee, they're still out there. And if they're still out there, because of the unethical work of the study, who's to say that it's not being replicated now? Look at the HeLa cells and how that came about. So I'm very excited to discuss it from my perspective as a descendant, as a scholar, and as a descendant, again, family member.
Dr. Guy?
Thank you. All right, so how am I going to follow that? Excuse me. So my name is Mignon Guy. I'm here from Virginia Commonwealth University. I'm in the Center for I'm in the Department of African American Studies. And so my knowledge, I'm just going to go back for a little bit and tell you guys that, for the first 14 years, I wasn't living in this country. I was living in the UK. So my experiences of research, race-related research, race and medicine, all of those didn't really come to fruition until I moved to the US, okay? So I teach, some of my students are here, by the way. I teach research methods at VCU in the Department of African American Studies, and I also teach a class called Black Health Matters, Social Determinants of Health in the African American Community. And in both of these classes, we do address issues related to Tuskegee, and we address them in different manners. So obviously for the research methods class, we go along the issue of human subjects and IRB. Oftentimes we go on tangents and discuss, how is it possible that scientists could get away with such behavior and things of this nature. And I think that, I don't know if my students can attest to this or not, but I'm not sure if they think that Tuskegee could happen again. After I was invited on this panel, I started to think about it in depth, thinking, what was the environment like that contributed to this happening, right? We had this sort of issue of otherness and marginalization and predatory behavior on low-income people, and particularly people of color. And I would venture to say that we're not that far from that environment right now. And so when we get to this position in society where we start to marginalize folks and we decide that somehow their lives are worth less, or somehow we place a higher, greater value on other populations, then we're sort of in the kitchen, ready to cook up a storm of the same sort of thing. In my Black Health Matters class, we talk about health disparities within the African American community, and we look at contributing factors to those health disparities and health inequalities. And as I think about Tuskegee, while we think about it as being, I'm a scientist, so I think about it as being a scientist in biomedical research, but at the same time, I think about it in terms of healthcare and the lack of healthcare, the lack of access to care, or withholding care, right? And so all of us that are in public health, we know that that's a current issue when we speak about health and equity. So there are a few elements that we haven't quite gotten rid of in our society, haven't moved past, that certainly could contribute to another Tuskegee happening. I'll tell you one more thing, and then I'm gonna send it back, which is, well, no, you know what? I'm gonna hold that back. I can just go on.
Dr. Johnson.
Yeah, definitely. This is power packed. Definitely glad to be here. I've had the opportunity to speak at so many different events, forums, or what have you, with not only just on the domestic level, but the international level as well. You know, as far as my background, grew up in the South, in Louisiana, in the deep South, might I add. And so with that, you know, family members from Alabama, Arkansas, kind of really across the states, out west coast, of course the East Coast as well. So understanding this, my great grandmother, she lived to be 101 of age, and so with that, really explaining to me some of the historical elements that have happened, not just Tuskegee study, but when you start to look at just things that have occurred socially, politically, as well as culturally, that have actually had an impact on people across the board. So whether you look at the minority or the majority population, you know, as far as USPHS, you know, one of my desires has been for, it started for me pursuing to be a USPHS officer, is to look at public health from a generational standpoint. It's not just, you know, from a policy standpoint. When you start looking at programs as well, we are actually fitted in so many different agencies based on the scope of work that we do. But looking at generational trauma, that's something that's been really significant for me. And my question out of that is like, where do we go from here? And so much of my work has been involved in looking at history, and as we talk today about, you know, trying to ensure that there are preventive measures in place so that as we move forward, we have those safeguards in place so that we can be able to not only ensure that our programs are ethically sound, but at the same time we're protecting individuals who may not have knowledge as to the full scope of what they're going to be involved in. You know, and so in conjunction with that work, it's a matter of, from my end, pushing really the envelope to where it's not just solely on researchers, you know, family members, you know, what have you, federal, state employees, those who are advocates in the field, but there is an element of everyone being involved. It's about collaboration, and that's something that from my end, U.S. Public Health Service end, and mind you, you know, I'm not speaking for the whole. I am an officer who serves in that regard, and I'm serving based on where I'm detailed to. But once again, my focus is, where do we go from here? Because we have history, we can look at Native American, we can look at the roots of so many different communities, but we have to pull things together to say, well, how can we work together to ensure that there is wellness and wholeness for all communities across the board.
Before I open it up for questions or comments from you all, I want to pick up on something that was mentioned by a couple of people here and ask a question to the panelists. And Dr. Guy, you referred to the social factors or social context in which the study occurred. And I wonder if you and others on the panel might address what were those social factors, what was that context in which this study took place as part of our grappling with the issue of whether or not it could happen again. Mr. Bird. What were the social conditions and social factors that might help explain how the study could even have occurred?
Well, as I said, the participants in the study weren't up in town in Tuskegee. They were from the rural areas around Tuskegee, farmers. They didn't know what the disease was. There were several diseases, and they just had common names for them, but not scientific names. And they were misled. And they told that they were participating in some study, and they'd get paid, they'd get transportation, they'd get burial rights. And so they thought they were doing a good thing for them and their families, and they had no idea that a drug came along called penicillin that people were treated with, but these people were not treated at all, never, not ever. And quite a number of them died. All of them in the study didn't have syphilis. On one side, there were people without syphilis. On the other side, people with syphilis. And they just wanted to see what the conditions of the patients looked like and as far as disease progressed. And poor us. And there was also a study that was carried out in Central America. Another one, but Tuskegee and then the one in Central America. And yes, it could happen again. You know, a lot of things are going backwards. So if we are not careful, and we don't stay on our toes, yes, it could happen again. Just like some other things are happening again, going to voting and things like that. So, yes, if we're not on our toes, these things could happen again. Thank you.
So, more history about that. There was a big campaign from the Rosenwald Foundation to start the whole education to bring forth helping undereducated blacks. So the social determinants of health, why the United States Public Health Service decided to come, we look at how the conditions of where people work, live, play, is because race and ethnicity, occupation, income, those type of variables. The misconception is that, and the running narrative is that all men that participated unwillingly, victimized, were illiterate, uneducated, they didn't know, and that is true, they didn't know, but all of them weren't. My great-great-grandfather, he was a clergyman. He was actually biracial. His mom was black, and his father was white. And his father, at that time, the Jim Crow area, left him farmland. So he had a cow, he had a chicken, he had a horse, back in those days, that's like a Cadillac, a Mercedes, and a BMW. And he wasn't illiterate. But it goes back into the issue of having access to care. And I think that's what we're dealing with right now in doing so. Now with my family, it was hush hush. My grandmother took care of my great-great-grandfather. He did have the disease, and he was like a pariah. The cankers were oozing out. It was to the point where he shriveled up as a small person, where the family, and you can smell the sores from what I heard from my family, you can smell the sores. You can see the suffering and the pain. And you're absolutely correct, they did not offer anything. One of the stories is that one of the men decided to go to, I believe, Montgomery or Birmingham, and he was turned away. So another thing, a misconception with the whole social determinants and everything else is how it's being portrayed now in the narrative. Has anyone ever seen the movie Miss Evers' Boys? Okay, so when it comes to that point, I want to have a nice discussion of Miss Evers' Boys. What I'm happy to hear is that no one has yet to call it the Tuskegee Syphilis study, because when you do that, you take away the ownership of who actually conducted the study. And then when you do that, you call it the Tuskegee Syphilis study, or the Tuskegee experiment, which dealt with the World War II Tuskegee Airmen, you disadvantage unethically the participants, the descendant family members, and assault us all over again, because if you know better, you should do better. But that's not always often the case. The same people that conducted the study were the same people that conducted the study in Guatemala. A lot of the things that we're dealing with now with health and healthcare disparities or inequities, depending on how you look at it, it's the structural inequities, looking at a socially disadvantaged group to an advantaged group, and looking at their relative hierarchies and position based on their wealth, power, and prestige. And I think it'll be good.
So I asked Mr. Bird I deferred to, Dr. Bird, because I thought it was important to understand. I know what I've read in terms of the social environment and how it sort of contributed to this study. But I felt that lived experiences would be better suited for this. But just picking up a little bit, so because I feel like I'm dancing around a little bit of the conversation, probably because I'm from the West Coast and I'm now living in the South, so I'm very careful about what I say here. But hey, I'm going up for 10 years, so who knows? If I don't get it, then I could just go back. So what I'm going to say is this, is that when we look at the abuses in medical experimentation, and I keep doing air quotes because I can't even call it that, historically in the US, we can see patterns that are occurring, right? So we see that it happens with people of color. So they refer to the Guatemalan studies, and we're talking about Tuskegee now, and there were many others that we don't hear about, that have not made the news necessarily, that are equally horrifying and highly problematic, and certainly have a detrimental impact on the health of the Black community and other communities of color. It's not just Black communities, because when you start to see that we will other or marginalize one group, the next person's worried about, what about me, right? So just because you target Black populations in studies does not mean that Latino populations or American Indian or Asian American populations may not be thinking, hey, I'm not really sure that I can trust these people. I'm not really sure that they'll be looking after my best interests as well. Excuse me. So Tuskegee, again, I'm not from the South, but Tuskegee, we're in the South, right? So we're in the 1930s through 1970s. I was born like 2 years after it ended in, I was 2 years old when the study ended, so technically someone I knew could have possibly been a part of it. But we have, as Dr. Bird suggested, or stated, we have individuals that are living in rural locations, right? So far away from the eyes, so you can't really see what's going on quite so much. We have this Jim Crow era that's looming about, right? Where people are not going to necessarily speak up because we have this sort of oppressive state happening in this country. That's what allows you to do this, right? And then we continue, we still have issues related to race, racism, and discrimination. And individuals worried about their livelihoods, just because of the way that they look, right? And so you have to, at some point, trust someone to try to help you, because you may not have the resources in your own community if you're low income, if you don't have access to care, if you, what else did he say? The absence of information, right? So keeping information from individuals. So you gotta just sort of rely on what people tell you, what you can go with, right? And so, is there any wonder why we did see this happen in Tuskegee to this specific population? It would be very easy, because nobody cares, because they're throwaway people, right? Or we can just, because how do you conduct a study on a disease knowing that this will kill them eventually, or other comorbidities may do so as well, other chronic diseases, and just watch it happen, and collect information from these people on a regular basis, and collect their data, and watch potentially their family become infected. So how do you do that? How does that happen? That only happens when we decide somehow that these people are not human, these people are less than, these people are just sort of, they're gonna take one for the team, right? So the rest of us could benefit from experimentation on these individuals, and we can just see what happens with their nature. This is what we do all the time. We still do this right now. We have a great deal of difficulty in this country in understanding the sort of undercurrents of race and racism and othering in this country, and we don't actually address it because we get nervous or people don't want to talk about it, and that's what allows the cycles to continue. Why do we see these things happening again and again on people of color? Why did we see things happen with Havasupai in Arizona, where we misuse their data? It's because we can. Right? We've been permitted to, because somehow we can excuse it. We can say, well, it was for the good of science. Or these individuals, they should just be grateful that they were able to get their burial, have their burials paid for, or something of that nature. So we have to start to think about, how do we, as public health practitioners, or as scientists, or just everyday American citizens, how do we start to look at others in a way, our fellow citizens, our fellow humans, in a way to understand that they have rights, they have privileges, they, whether or not they're low income, whether or not they're black, whether or not they're living in a rural location, or whatever you have. How do we start to, whether or not they're Republican or Democrat, how's that? How do we start to see individuals as humans and begin to identify, okay, these people have needs, and I will not traipse upon their rights as individuals, right? And how do we start to see that health care, which was withheld from these individuals, from these men at this time, is a right and not a privilege in this country. And when we start to address some of these underlying values that we have, then perhaps we can begin to correct the broader social context to make sure that we don't go into the same place.
Well, these are some very good points that have been presented. One thing that I can say from the contextual framework, I'm going to put out here the concept of dependency. This is something that really plays on the psyche of an individual. Am I independent by being dependent? And you will find that, just as what's been mentioned here, in a lot of rural areas, the independency is that, well, I'm out here, this is my space, but at the same time, I don't have the access that may very well be afforded if I'm in a more close-knit community where there are resources there. And so it's a challenge there. I mean, I know when you start looking at the dependency, we talk about historically where persons who were involved in the study and that they were seeking an opportunity, that would afford health care based on what was presented, based on the burial rights. So it's almost as if you already had a death sentence that was there. So that's a challenge for me, based on, it's like, well, did you come into this particular engagement with the mindset that, well, we're going to provide assistance, but based on what you have been assessed to have, there's going to be an end versus there being a recovery, if you will. So my thing is that, I look at in studying this, and just also just across the board, we look at the black migration, when we think about that in that time frame that went all the way up to the 1970s, where persons of color, they transitioned from the South, okay, and then they transitioned to the Northeast. They were seeking other areas, and I'm glad it was mentioned here about a descendant that, you know, individuals were not all illiterate. There were individuals who were very knowledgeable, but, you know, I'm going to state that no one was illiterate because they had some knowledge and some capacity because they were sharecroppers. I have family members who actually own land in Mississippi, and so they were very knowledgeable in regards to how to conduct business. And my thing is that, but at the same time, the dependency is something that's a struggle, because, you know, now I'm going to be dependent upon what someone else is presenting to me, to where I'm going to take it as gold, and I'm not going to ask questions because we have it today. You know, we have today. I mean, I work with global communities, and so many will come in and say, well, I'm not going to ask any questions because I feel if I do, then I'm not going to receive the services. And that's a challenge. And we say, well, no, that's not the case. And so, but a lot of things are challenging for them as they're coming from their native country, and that's how the landscape is. But that's not how it should be here in the States in which we live. But dependency is something that's challenging going forward, because I work with communities in Washington, D.C., homeless populations, persons who have HIV, individuals who've gone through all types of situations, and their mindset is that, well, this is how I am, and so I'm dependent upon someone else to do something for me. And I don't have the mindset, you know, I never have been conditioned to have a different mindset that I'm going to do something for myself. And that's something that's challenging, and I'm going to really encourage, you know, because I tell all of my colleagues that it's one thing to teach, it's one thing to come and speak, it's one thing to be on the panel, but when you still roll up your sleeves, and that's something that I do on a regular basis, and go out into the community, that's a totally different thing, because you're able to really empower, you know, persons to say, well, this is not who you are more than this. And then it moves them from a place of just being dependent on quote unquote a system, and then they're going to be granted access, because now when I go in, I'm going to have the education and the knowledge to ask the right questions and not be afraid to ask questions, because that's something that not only I'm being conditioned to do here now, but it's something that those who are knowledgeable, they have actually empowered me by educating me, by having boots on the ground. This is something that we are about. I remember my grandfather telling me a lot of things that occurred when he was actually growing up. And so I had to walk everywhere, so he pulled cotton, and just a lot of different things that occurred. And he told me something I remember as a child. He said, you know, son, we can always say that we didn't know. He said, but someone knew. He said, and that's why we asked the question, those individuals who did know something, did they come forth and to share that information? I'm saying that here now because we, you know, you just brought the context in regards to, you know, how can we challenge the system? We challenge the system based on, once again, not just trying to, you mentioned about the political landscape. You know, do we approach things from a standpoint like, well, am I going to touch this? Well, I'm going to only touch it just a little bit because of the fact that, well, I don't want the other element to impact me because this is going to impact me financially if I lean in too far. So this is something that is a challenge, and I say that because I've served on boards, and I asked the question when a memo was going to be submitted to go upstream to congressional officials, and I said, well, now the question should be not who we are advocating for. The question is, where do you stand as a person? Because I said, I guarantee you, if you're saying that you are sending this forward to advocate for someone, but you voted for the other side, quote unquote, if you want to go in from that angle, then you voted one way, now you're going to come sit at the table and say, I'm supporting this. It doesn't add up. And so this is a challenge that I tell individuals, because definitely from the public health standpoint, this is something that we are challenged with, because we go in even now working with Native American communities. You talk about have a soup pie, you know, I would helicopter down there. So I worked heavily with that community. And so once again, it's the same thing, utilizing blood samples, things of that nature, and there's a lack of trust. Everything has to go through the tribal leadership now. And once again, so many things that are presented now, they're not willing to even open the door for it to come in. And you say, wait a minute, this is a best practice. This is something that could really benefit you. But they said, no, we don't trust because of the generational trauma. So they are still dependent upon not only not having anything, they're dependent upon the historical element that has their psyche so locked down that they're in bondage that they can't even see past that. How do you work with that? It takes a team. It takes, you know, empathy. It takes this passion, and you have to be passionate as well in regards to how you approach these things, you know, from a research standpoint, but also from a hands-on approach. You have to get down, you know, really get down to the nitty-gritty and really hold someone's hand to say, hey, I'm going to walk with you through this so you can get to a place where we know you can have a better life.
Dr. Marshall? And then we'll open it up for some questions from the audience.
So I agree that structural violence, and by that I mean things that are in place in institutions and or governments allow for continued oppression of people. They may not be bad actors individually, but they are people who are part of a community and aren't paying attention. And also institutional racism. You know, both of these things allowed for these studies that we've been talking about today. I want to tell you about a study in South Carolina and just kind of quickly give you a general overview of that. That study led me to work both in perinatal substance use disorder and public health approaches to it, as well as fundamental work in human subjects protections. I chaired the National Human Research Protections Advisory Committee that was appointed under the Clinton administration by the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Donna Shalala. And that was a golden moment in Washington, D.C., because a lot of bad things had happened. Duke University had been shut down by the former Office of Protection from Research Risks. A number of studies. Jesse Gelsinger died at the University of Pennsylvania in a gene transfer study that was terribly flawed. And so how did that journey occur with me ending up during that time period of chairing that advisory committee and working with the newly formed Office for Human Research Protections? Greg Koski was the first leader of that group. It happened in South Carolina. I went from the University of Virginia to the Medical University of South Carolina in 1993. I grew up in the South. I grew up in Virginia. And when I found myself in Charleston, South Carolina, I asked myself, what country am I living in? Because the racism among some was so blatant. There was no attempt to hide it. It was terribly blatant. And so if you weren't part of the structural violence, then you weren't paying attention or you didn't care, as has already been said. There was a policy in South Carolina at the Medical University that got at the problem of substance use by pregnant women, and it obtained only at the Medical University of South Carolina, the public hospital. It was in the clinic, right? So where patients who didn't have private obstetricians would go for their care in a public hospital. And the policy was a tripartite venture between the Medical University of South Carolina, the Charleston city police, and the local solicitor or federal prosecutor's office. And basically the way it worked was that women who came into the clinic had their urine screened without their knowledge. If they tested positive for illegal drugs, they got a letter from the solicitor saying you have tested positive for illegal drugs while you're pregnant. If you do not continue with prenatal care and enter substance abuse treatment, and if you miss one of those appointments, you will be arrested, the word will being underlined. And under that policy, 39 women were arrested. All of them but one were black. The one woman who was not had written in the medical record of her chart by Shirley Brown, who was the high-risk obstetrical case manager, boyfriend is a Negro. So 2 weeks after I got to Charleston in '93, a lawsuit was filed in federal district court. That case, Ferguson versus the City of Charleston et al., went all the way to the Supreme Court. There was also a side of that, and it's a very well-known case. There was a side of it that has a research ethics component that most people don't know. So Charles Condon, the solicitor, Shirley Brown, and Ed Horker, the OB chairman of OBGYN, published a paper in the Journal of the South Carolina Medical Association, giving the results of a year's worth of data on this policy. And they claimed that the number of women testing positive for illegal drugs had dropped, that women were not going outside of the state or foregoing prenatal care. And then they also said, and we will report back a year from now with more data. So they made claims to efficacy about this program of theirs. The then Office of Protection from Research Risks heard about the study, a complaint was made, and they came down to the Medical University of South Carolina and did an investigation. And from their perspective, this was research on human subjects without their consent or their knowledge. So OPRR gave the Medical University of South Carolina a chance. They said, we want your IRB to take a look at this and tell us whether this was research, whether it should have gone through the IRB, whether there should have been informed consent, and all of the protections that the federal regulations provide. The IRB convened a special group to look at it. I was on the IRB. I, as the institution's bioethicist, and was not asked to serve on that small group. And they got it wrong. They said, no, this isn't research. There was no research protocol, and so forth. OHRP, or the Office of Protection from Research Risks, came back and said, au contraire. You published in the Journal of the South Carolina Medical Association, and you made a claim to generalizable knowledge, which is kind of the fundamental definition of research, right, under the federal regulations. And I want to read to you just a couple of excerpts from an article that was written by the former chair of the University of Mississippi's IRB. He was writing in response to a paper that Charles Condon published in Policy Review. The title of that paper was Clinton's Cocaine Babies. Why won't the Clinton administration let us save our babies? And where Mr. Condon also made claims to efficacy. So he says, the author of the chair of the University of Mississippi's IRB said, I submitted this research article to several other experienced investigators in the field of health services research, as well as to a class of doctoral students in research methodology, all of whom independently rejected the research as having any validity whatsoever. And here were just briefly, there were a number of findings, right? Why it was research, but it was sloppy and inadequate methodology. But the primary one was lack of informed consent and unconscionable and unethically coercive nature of the study. He said, it taxes the imagination that there might not have been one middle or upper class white pregnant woman in the city of Charleston who used cocaine. To me, it is obvious that Mr. Condon's program targeted a particularly vulnerable and politically safe minority population. Federal law prohibits the use of any type of coercion in order to enroll subjects in an experimental research program. Mr. Condon contradicts himself by arguing for a program that used not only a carrot, but a real and very firm stick. And I think I'll just read the very last one there. It is absolutely clear to me that the South Carolina policy fails all tests of ethical, scientific, legal, and humanistic standards of conduct. The regulations regarding how persons in positions of authority treat their fellow men and women with respect to experimentation and research are founded on conservative philosophical principles of autonomy, justice, and beneficence. For me, the most troubling aspect of this case, besides the human research subject violations, is their staunch denial of violating these principles in the face of uniform public opinion to the contrary. And I'll stop there.
Okay, we have a few minutes for any questions or comments that you all may have in the audience. Augustine over there, you want to let everyone see you. Has a mic in case you have something to say. We want everyone to be able to hear.
My name's Laurie Furlano. I work at the Virginia Department of Health. If you had a word of advice to the room of public health practitioners, several of whom in this room are in positions of decision-making authority, what advice would you give them to lessen these behaviors moving forward in our work?
Yeah, definitely a good question. Having served as a participant protection officer for SAMHSA, Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, of course, as we know, we look at studies of the past from the public health standpoint, but right now it's not just solely on the federal government. The funding stream, there is some research that's done to some of the through some of the federal agencies, but a lot of the monies are actually allocated and then distributed to the states and then to the local level. So my word would be, as we look at these grants that go out, the funding that goes out, and there serves notice for criteria, and that there's an evaluation that supports the program itself, but to ensure that all of the protocols, such as we talk about the consent measures, looking at the risk level, all of that, looking at incentives. One thing that I found, just when we talk about earlier about the dependency, individuals were given the perspective of healthcare in exchange for participating in this study. So now when we look at a lot of these funding for these grants based on the research that's done at the local level, the local, county, state level, and then they bring it in to an aggregate, and they separate it in that regard to determine, okay, well, we need money to actually address this particular issue or concern within our state. But once again, what are the incentives? Look at that. Those are some of the things that are addressed within the protocols for as that participant protection review. Because some may say, well, a person will only get a gift card or, $25. So you're not really coercing someone. You're not trying to really assume the outcome before it actually starts. Someone will actually have the right to remove oneself from the study, to make sure those things are in place, ensuring that the benefits outweigh the risk. And what are the risks? It could be something emotional to ensure that if that's the case, to make sure there is, for example, some type of behavioral health component that's associated with that study where individuals can process. So my thing is, once again, look at how your program is structured. Make sure that your leadership, your public health advisors are in tune with the research protocols, and to make sure that they are not only adhering to those based on what they present, but those persons who are going to carry out and execute it, you have your checks and balances in place from a compliance standpoint to review everything that's happening on an interval basis, whatever you determine necessary based on the type of research that you're doing.
My response is, I believe my response is very elementary, and I say that as in, as you go forth, as I am a budding public health practitioner, researcher, as I figure out my way of postdoc or going to government or everything else. But what I have learned on my journey, besides the structural aspect of it, is that we all have different paradigms. And if we think about that study, they had all of these resources in place, and they decided whether or not to go forth with the protocol, which they didn't have. And as you have, stated, that they disregarded all of that. And I think as we go on with decision making, a very quick ethical lens, looking at race and ethnicity, sex or gender, income, employment, just that quickly. Because even though we'll have these, when I'm seeing these policies in place, at the end of the day, it's very subjective. So I think, along with what Dr. Johnson said, but also look into yourself and self-reflect, because again, every time we make a decision, it's based off of our paradigm, and it's very difficult to have a schism when you're making a decision without bringing in your own inherent bias. So as you go forward with the policies and the leadership to address your own ethical lens and see that you have to step outside of that and look at it through those lenses, you maybe can adjust it even more, that can better help with those decisions.
So this will be quick. I want to just bring to your attention a paper that was written by Jerry Minikoff, who was a colleague of mine at the University of Kansas Medical Center, and he's now the director of the Office for Human Research Protections. He wrote a paper prior to being the director. Jerry is an ophthalmologist and an attorney. And the title of the paper is Could Tuskegee Happen Today? It was published in the St. Louis University School of Law Review. So it's a really well-written and interesting paper. And he makes this observation in his paper. He said, could it happen today? And he cites the lead abatement study that was undertaken at Johns Hopkins University's Kennedy Krieger Institute. And it was a study that looked at different methods and costs of abating lead in lower income housing in the city of Baltimore. And the issue in that study was not that there wasn't informed consent by the parents of children in the study, there was, but how risks were disclosed. And the point there, or Jerry's point, is not only do you need to disclose the risks of the study itself, but in that situation, the risks that the people who are subjects of or participants in the study already face, and that would include that you're living in poverty, that you're living in a home that has lead-based paint in the walls, and those other things. Because the critique of the study was, this is a public health institution that's doing the study, but is not really talking about, to parents or families living in that housing, about the degree of and the depths of the risks which they and especially their children face. So that wasn't part of it. So thinking about protections, having a robust data and safety monitoring committee, and then also being really serious about how do we protect subjects from those potential risks. And too often that's neither the IRB, I would say, nor the investigators really think about that in a serious manner, and you just alluded to that.
So, as being an instructor or professor, I think that it's important to learn, to educate yourself, right? So we're talking about Tuskegee, which is one example, but there are a multitude of other examples that have happened all the way up until like 1998, if not more recent, that you see my students like, ooh, yeah. So it's important to understand. So there's a book called Washington's book, Medical Apartheid. So you guys have read it? Oh, well, okay, fine. So it's a great book to understand the history, right? So to see these patterns that are occurring, to see all of the various sectors that this can happen in prisons, right? Which we think that it can't, but I'm not so sure. With children that are wards of the state, or that are foster children, or possibly even children that are sitting on our border right now, who knows? But I think it's important to understand the history of these practices. Then we can figure out how better to intervene, because we can recognize them more easily, right? Because the last thing we want to think about is if something happens right before our eyes, we don't want to think, oh, this can't really be what's happening, right? And if we don't know the history, if we don't know the patterns, if we don't know what to recognize, then things can occur right before us. So I think that understanding the history of medical experimentation, of research in America, and the use of vulnerable populations the way that we have is critically important to move forward. And it's a good read.
I'd also recommend by Dorothy Roberts, Killing the Black Body. Wonderful presentation on how bias and implicit bias in particular can lead to ill effects for people of color. Any other questions or comments from the audience? Yes.
So I worked when I was at University of Florida in grad school. We had a program to improve research participation among marginalized and unrepresented populations in research, because we know that there will be a lot of things that come out that the only folks in that study were middle-class white men, or that was the only thing that was there. But kind of balancing as well, just taking these additional precautions and looking at that. I guess two things. One, we know that, when you were talking about like children who are in foster care, there are HIV studies that were just disclosed like maybe 10 years ago through Hopkins and through Columbia, where they were using children who are in foster care. And we know that children in foster care, a big part of that is incarceration of their parents. So that's a whole other thing there. But yeah, that those were studies funded by the NIH, where they were not sure that like the safety of those medications on adults, let alone children, who didn't have the ability to really have that advocate there that you talked about. So that's like, we know that it's not the far past, and we also know that there's usually a 10 to 15 year lag time between it happening and us finding out about it. But on that flip side, when we think about wanting to also ensure that medical research and that medical advancements include all parts of the population, how do we do that in a way that like is acknowledges that we don't all come from the same place, and that we have those that power over people who might participate.
Who wants to tackle?
So I have one comment, and that is, as you said, right? It took us in the United States until the late 90s, right? Ruth Faden and her colleagues at Hopkins and work by the Institute of Medicine to understand from a federal research protection that women weren't men. It took us until the early 2000s to understand that children are not little adults. And there's a final horizon that we're just crossing now, and I would advocate for this, and that is pregnant women are not non-pregnant women. And so we, just as many of the drugs that are out there in the formulary have never been tested on children, the same goes for pregnant women and effects on them, and also their developing fetuses. And so I think that's a new horizon, and it's a big challenge. The Zika pandemic recently was perhaps an example of how internationally our thoughts about who to include, right, in research, and both in terms of vaccines and others, and do we include pregnant women? Do they have access, for example, to abortions or to choices besides having this child? So all of the things that we've been talking about today were part and parcel of the evolution of that pandemic and our response to it. So that doesn't answer your question, but.
Yeah, let me just say one thing here is that to your question, definitely there has to be a balance. You know, when we look at research, and you wanted it from both sides of the spectrum, if you will, we have to start, I would say, putting our energy in the area that really matters, the economics, okay? Because I find it so interesting that when I look at so many components of research, we will find that there are certain groups that are already pre-identified as being ripe, if you will, for a study. Why is that the case? You look at the span of time and how economy has been so impactful to maintaining classism, if you will, and you look at that and how persons are not only defined, but they are actually positioned to be a part of studies that, in all essence, they say, well, this is going to support the funding. I had a situation back in the day, let me just put it that way, to where I presented a study to look at domestic violence within communities that were affluent. Now, I had already conducted some preliminary research and found that a lot of high-end persons who were Caucasian, they had lots of money, very affluent, and there was a lot of domestic violence going on. So individuals were coming out, but their wives were being abused, but at the same time, they would not come forward. Now, I presented to actually to assist to come in and do a study. Now, I was advised, like, well, that's not the study that's really going to sell. Okay, and so in all essence, it would be more suitable for you to focus on the African American community because already pre-identified. So what does that say about me? I'm included in that equation. So my thing is, once again, there has to be a balance where we start to question why is it that, and I find researchers, once again, of all ethnic backgrounds coming to the table saying, well, this is who we need to look at. Why won't you come to the table and say we need to look at someone else? So we're at fault. And so I'm going to challenge all of us here to where when you go back, you know, and those who are coming up in the field, start to look at things from a different vantage point. You know, if I scratch myself as someone else, we're going to bleed red blood. That's what I'm thinking, unless there's some other type of condition or something going on, ma'am, that you know, can definitely bring forth. But that means that all of us have challenges. There are things going on within the communities that we can tap into that will really help to balance things out, where we can basically see we need to put money in other areas, you know, versus it just being solely in certain populations being identified as being impoverished, and that's where we're going to spend our effort in trying to do research on. If we're doing so much research, how much of the research is actually benefiting to help someone come up? That would be my question.
So thank you for your comment. So I also, in my older days, when I was in Arizona, I used to work at the Mayo Clinic in Arizona. And part of my job was helping to develop a biobank, a Hispanic biobank, right? And so we get to this issue of precision medicine now. And so we're in this place where we want to do clinical trials, where we want to do research. We need to have everyone participate, okay? But at the same time, we need to make sure that, while we need to make sure that we have adequate representation, we have to make sure that the populations that are part of the process, right, that they're at the table. We also need to make sure that program officers, I'm glad that you actually mentioned, I'm going off on a tangent a little bit, because you said why don't we do research in certain areas? Well, because they won't pay us, they won't fund us, right? It's as sad as that. When I was young and idealistic, I thought, oh, I'm gonna do research, I'm gonna save the world, I'm gonna come out, I'm gonna like fix all of these inequalities and inequity, and then you find out when you get into the game that it's publish or perish. If you don't shift or tweak or modify the study that you know needs to be done for that community, it won't get published or it won't get funded, right? So we need to start considering, like, how do we have input in that area in terms of the funding streams? And how do we have a better sort of or how do we have stakeholders at the table that are determining which populations we study for which disease states and who we include in studies, because it makes sense, because scientifically it makes sense, not because that's the next sexy topic, du jour, right? So we have to find a better way of doing that. But in terms of clinical trial recruitment, so when you were speaking, I thought about something, which is, when I came to VCU, I had this opportunity to start a biobank here, right? And I was thinking, I was told by many that, well, Mignon, if you do this, you're gonna be set for tenure, and we already knew where the funding was coming from, and everything would have been great. And I thought to myself, and it was all on African American populations, go figure. And so I struggled with that for maybe 2-3 years when I first got here. And sometimes I bring it up in class because I ask my students, should I do this project? And it's interesting because half of them will say, no, you can't do that, because you don't know how those data are going to be used in the long run, which I know that to be the case, which that's what stopped me, right? I don't know that if I collect these data, my funding agency really owns those data. I don't own those data. So I can only protect those data so much, right? And I have to be able to sleep with myself at night. But then the other hand, my students will say, well, if you don't do it, Dr. Guy, someone else is going to do it. And then they may not care as much as you do, right? So I'm still throwing this project up in my head today. And 3 years, 4 years, 5 years later now, actually, trying to figure out where do I place myself in order to protect the populations that I care about, underserved, vulnerable populations, but also to make sure that we have adequate data and that we have good studies, solid studies, to ensure that they have access to the care that other folks will have, and if they're not present, then they won't, right? So we have to figure out ways of sort of challenging ourselves and situating ourselves in this conversations, but certainly, we've got to be stakeholders. We've got to have a seat at the table.
We started a bit late, so I let us go a little long here, but I think we should probably wrap up the formal session. I'd like to invite Dr. Powell back up to say some closing remarks.
Okay, let's please give our panelists a round of applause. Dr. Barry, Dr. Johnson, Dr. Oliver, the future Dr. Carr, and Dr. Guy. I just want to thank all of you for sharing your insights with us. It was a very interesting conversation. I hope it brought more context to you, left you with some things to think about. I want to thank you for joining us. A couple of shout outs. One, there are more events happening this week for National Public Health Week. Please check that out. And two, this is Minority Health Month, and so the Office of Health Equity has a number of activities, including a workout shortly later today, and several throughout the month, so please join us. And please do take something from here today and apply it to our work in public health. Thank you.